"You human males will breed us, or your squad dies," proclaimed Zephyr, matriarch of the Ethoria. Her piercing blue eyes bore into Captain Kyle Thomas as her ultimatum hung in the air, the fate of his recon team in the balance. Kyle's mission had been simple: investigate the distress signal emanating from this mysterious planet. But now, captured by the towering azure-skinned Ethorian females, the stakes had skyrocketed beyond anything he could have imagined. The Ethorians' once perfect civilization teetered on the brink of collapse, a genetic plague rendering their males infertile. In desperation, they turned to the humans as their unlikely saviors, deeming them genetically compatible breeding partners. Zephyr laid bare the severity of the crisis. The warmongering Krull had engineered the infertility plague to weaken the Ethorians before mounting a full-scale invasion. With time running out, the Ethorians saw forced breeding with the humans as their only path to survival. Kyle's mind raced as he stood before the Ethorian High Council, grappling with the weight of Zephyr's demands. Submit to becoming breeding stock, or condemn his men to lobotomization and their seed harvested against their will. But Kyle was a soldier, not a stallion. He countered with a daring proposal. His squad would fight alongside the Ethorians against the Krull, in exchange for the right to choose their own willing Ethorian mates. A tenuous compromise, but one that might just save both their species. As the Krull warships amassed at the edges of the star system, the true scale of the impending onslaught became terrifyingly clear. Kyle knew he would have to push himself and his men beyond their limits, wielding Ethorian technology to enhance their abilities, if they hoped to repel the invaders. The humans found themselves in a fight for the very survival of the Ethorians, their own fates now inextricably tied to the outcome. Kyle steeled himself for the battle to come, knowing that failure would mean not just death, but the extinction of an entire race. As the Krull warships dropped out of hyperspace on the fringes of the Ethorian system, alarms blared across the planet. Kyle sprinted to the briefing room where Zephyr and her generals had gathered. "It's now or never," Zephyr said grimly, pulling up a hologram of the incoming Krull fleet. "This is our one chance to cut the head off the snake." Kyle nodded, studying the projection of the massive Krull dreadnought at the center of the formation. "My team will board that command ship and capture their warlord. We stop him. We stop this invasion in its tracks." Boarding the cloaked Ethorian transport, Kyle and his hand-picked strike team of humans and Ethorians slipped past the Krull defenses and latched onto the hull of the dreadnought undetected. They cut their way in, breaching into a dimly lit corridor. Krull warriors, their reptilian hides glistening under the red light, surged toward the strike team. Pulse rifle fire lit up the passageway as the pitched battle erupted. Kyle ducked under a swinging tech blade from a cyborg Krullian, slamming his retrofitted Ethorian sidearm into the creature's skull with a sickening crunch. They fought their way to the bridge, leaving a trail of Krull corpses in their wake. The doors to the command deck exploded inward. Through the smoke strode Malachi, the Krull warlord. He was a towering behemoth, his scaly flesh fused with whirring cybernetics. "You dare challenge me, human?" Malachi snarled, his voice a grating mechanical roar. Kyle raised his sidearm. "Your invasion ends here, Malachi. Surrender." The Krull leader responded with a blast from his shoulder-mounted plasma cannon. Kyle rolled away as the superheated plasma melted a crater in the deck where he'd been standing a heartbeat before. Lunging at the warlord, Kyle unleashed a flurry of blows, his Ethorian-enhanced speed and strength driving Malachi back. The Krull's tail lashed out, sending Kyle crashing into a bulkhead. Stars exploded across his vision. Malachi loomed over him, raising his tech blade for the killing blow. With a defiant yell, Kyle surged to his feet, catching the descending blade in his cybernetically enhanced fist. The sound of screeching metal filled the air as Kyle slowly twisted Malachi's arm back. "It's over," Kyle growled through gritted teeth. With a final heave, he wrenched the blade from Malachi's grip, flipping the warlord over his shoulder and slamming him to the deck. The sharp tip of the tech blade hovered inches from Malachi's throat. "Order your fleet to stand down and retreat," Now. Kyle's words were cold and hard. The Krull warlord glared at him balefully for a long moment before activating the comms. All ships, stand down. The invasion is terminated. Retreat to the void. As quickly as they had arrived, the Krull fleet vanished back into hyperspace. Cheers erupted from the Ithorian ships as the invaders fled. The dreadnought, its command crew dead or captured, drifted helplessly. Returning to Ithoria, Kyle and his team were greeted as heroes. Zephyr embraced him fiercely, her blue skin flushed with joy and relief. You did it, Kyle, she whispered. You saved our people. But the jubilant mood was short-lived. Zephyr pulled Kyle aside, her expression troubled. There's something you need to know. While you were gone, some of your men, they've begun mating with our females, voluntarily. Kyle's eyes widened at the revelation. I don't know what to say. There's more, Zephyr continued hesitantly. The High Council has proposed an alliance, a trade, your genetic material for our technology and support. Kyle's head swam as he grappled with the implications. Before he could respond, a commotion erupted in the streets outside. Screams of terror mixed with animalistic roars. By the gods, what now? Zephyr's face paled as a report came through on her comms. It's Lyra, my sister. She's one of the ones who bred with your kind. Kyle, something's gone horribly wrong. She's changed. She's tearing the city apart. Kyle's blood ran cold as he realized the horrifying scope of the crisis they now faced, eclipsing even the Krull invasion. The Ithorian females impregnated by his men were mutating, becoming unhinged, and Lyra, driven mad by the changes racking her body, had escaped into the wilds. Driven by guilt and desperation, Kyle gathered his team once more. We've got to find her, subdue her before more people get hurt. For days, they combed the dense jungles of Ithoria, following the trail of destruction left by Lyra's rampage. Deep in the untamed wilderness, they stumbled upon a hidden base bearing the sigil of the Krull. Infiltrating the compound, Kyle made a heart-stopping discovery. Dozens of Ithorian females, their bodies twisted by unspeakable experiments, were held in containment cells. In the center of the lab stood Malachi's chief scientist, a hunched, withered Krull with madness gleaming in his eyes. You're too late, human, the scientist cackled. The Ithorians were merely test subjects for the true goal, the perfect melding of Krull and Ithorian DNA, an unbeatable hybrid to replace the Krull you so mercilessly slaughtered. And thanks to your genetic contributions, I've finally achieved it. The horrible scope of the multiple crises crashed over Kyle like a tsunami. The Krull had engineered not just the infertility plague, but the mutations now manifesting in Lyra and the others. The fight for the future of Ithoria had only just begun, and Kyle suddenly found himself at the center of a maelstrom that threatened to consume them all. Kyle signaled to his team as they approached the hidden Krull base. Zephyr and her Ithorian warriors flanked them, their blue skin camouflaged against the dense foliage. The facility loomed ahead, a stark metal structure jutting from the jungle floor. On my mark, Kyle whispered into his comm. He raised his hand, then dropped it swiftly. Go! The joint human-Ithorian force surged forward. Krull guards opened fire from defensive positions. Plasma bolts sizzled through the air. Kyle dove behind a fallen tree trunk, returning fire with his Ithorian pulse rifle. The weapon hummed as it discharged, dropping a Krull soldier in mid-charge. Zephyr vaulted over Kyle's cover, her long limbs propelling her into the fray. She engaged a Krull in hand-to-hand combat, her enhanced strength matching the reptilian creature blow for blow. Kyle provided covering fire, allowing Zephyr to gain the upper hand and snap the Krull's neck with a sickening crunch. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was mere minutes. When the last Krull fell, Kyle's team breached the facility. The stench of chemicals and decay assaulted them as they entered. By the gods, Zephyr gasped as they reached the main lab. Rows of containment pods lined the walls, each holding an Ithorian in various stages of mutation. Some were barely recognizable, their once elegant features twisted into grotesque approximations of Krull physiology. Kyle's blood ran cold as he approached one of the pods. Inside, an Ithorian female thrashed violently, her skin mottled with patches of crawl-like scales. Her eyes snapped open, feral and filled with rage. "Lyra," Zephyr whispered, pressing a hand to the glass. Before anyone could react, Lyra's fist smashed through the containment field. Alarms blared as she tore free, her mutated form towering over them. With a primal roar, she charged. Kyle barely had time to shout a warning before Lyra barreled into him, sending him flying across the lab. He crashed into a bank of computers, pain exploding through his body. Lyra advanced on Zephyr, who stood frozen in shock. "Lyra, please," Zephyr pleaded. "It's me, your sister." But there was no recognition in Lyra's eyes, only blind fury. She lashed out, her elongated claws raking across Zephyr's arm. Kyle struggled to his feet, knowing he had to act fast. He tackled Lyra from behind, using every ounce of his enhanced strength to wrestle her to the ground. They grappled furiously, Lyra's newfound power threatening to overwhelm him. Kyle managed to lock her in a chokehold, squeezing with all his might. "I'm sorry," he grunted as Lyra's struggles weakened. Finally, she went limp in his arms. In the aftermath, Kyle's team secured the Krull databanks. The information they uncovered sent chills down their spines. Malachi's plan was far more insidious than they'd imagined. "He wanted to replace us entirely," Zephyr said, her voice hollow as she read through the files. "The infertility plague, the mutations, it was all leading to this." Kyle watched as Zephyr's expression hardened. She keyed her comm, broadcasting to all Ithorian frequencies. "This is High Matriarch Zephyr. By emergency decree, all mating between Ithorians and humans is to cease immediately. The risk is too great." The response was immediate and divided. Some Ithorians accepted the order without question, while others protested vehemently. Kyle could hear the voices of pregnant Ithorian females, desperate and angry. "You can't do this," one shouted over the comm. "These are our children." Zephyr's face was a mask of pain as she made her next declaration. "All affected Ithorians, including my sister Lyra, are to be placed in quarantine for their own safety and the safety of others." The situation deteriorated rapidly. Reports flooded in of hybrid pregnancies progressing at an accelerated rate, the offspring growing increasingly unstable. Zephyr established a secure zone on Ithoria, but many refused to comply. As Kyle helped oversee the quarantine efforts, alarms blared across the capital city. He sprinted to the command center, arriving just in time to see security footage of Malachi's escape. The Krull warlord tore through his Ithorian guards smoothly, a mad gleam in his cybernetic eyes. "He's rallying his remaining forces," an Ithorian officer reported. "We're picking up chatter about restarting the breeding program." Kyle's mind raced. He knew he had to stop Malachi, but the sounds of unrest in the streets below told him the Ithorian civilization was on the brink of tearing itself apart. Time was running out, and he had to make a choice. Kyle's comm crackled to life, blaring urgent alerts as Malachi's forces descended on the Ithorian capital. Explosions rocked the city, and screams filled the air. Kyle sprinted through the streets, rallying scattered defenders. "Zephyr, Malachi's breached the isolation zone," he shouted into his comm. "The hybrids are loose." A terrifying roar answered him. Lyra, now a hulking monstrosity of Ithorian and Krull features, smashed through a nearby building. Her eyes locked onto Kyle, filled with rage and confusion. "Lyra, stop!" Kyle pleaded, dodging her massive fists. "This isn't you." But Lyra was beyond reason. Kyle fought defensively, unwilling to harm Zephyr's sister. His hesitation cost him as Lyra's claws raked across his chest, drawing blood. Across the city, Zephyr rallied her loyalists. "Defend the cloning facilities at all costs," she ordered, leading a charge against Malachi's Krull soldiers. The battle raged through the streets. Human and Ithorian fighters stood shoulder to shoulder, pulse rifles blazing against the Krull onslaught. But the hybrids turned the tide, their mutated forms wreaking havoc. Kyle finally managed to subdue Lyra, using a stun baton to incapacitate her. But the fight left him battered and bleeding. He stumbled towards the cloning facility, knowing Malachi's true goal. Inside, he found Zephyr cornered by the Krull warlord. Malachi's cybernetic enhancements whirred as he input commands into the cloning vats. "Watch, Ithorian," Malachi growled, "as I create the future of both our races." Kyle, mustering his last reserves of strength, crawled to a nearby console. His fingers flew across the controls, inputting the virus he'd prepared for just such an eventuality. "Not today, you scaly bastard," Kyle muttered, hitting the final command. The facility erupted in chaos. Alarms blared as the gene-scrambling virus spread through the system. Malachi roared in fury as his nascent hybrid army dissolved before his eyes. Outside, the virus spread through the air, affecting the rampaging hybrids. One by one, they reverted to their original Ithorian forms, confused and disoriented. Zephyr seized the moment, leading her forces in a final push. The Krull, now outnumbered and outgunned, retreated in disarray. In the aftermath, Zephyr stood before the gathered survivors, her face a mask of sorrow. "We've won," she announced, "but at a terrible cost." She turned to the gathered hybrids, including her sister Lyra. "I'm sorry," Zephyr whispered, raising her weapon. "There's no other way." Kyle watched, heart heavy, as Zephyr carried out the grim task of euthanizing the former hybrids. The Ithorian capital lay in ruins, its population decimated. As the dust settled, Zephyr approached Kyle, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and desperation. "We need your help to rebuild," she began, but stopped short as a comm signal interrupted them. "Kyle," a human voice crackled through, "we've got a situation. You're going to want to hear this." Kyle's comm crackled with static, interrupting the urgent message. He tapped the device, straining to hear through the interference. The voice on the other end sent chills down his spine. "Commander, we've got a situation," the panicked voice of his lieutenant cut through. "Several Ithorian females. They're pregnant, with hybrids." Kyle's blood ran cold. He sprinted to the medical wing, pushing past bewildered Ithorians. Inside, he found Zephyr hunched over a terminal, her face ashen. "It's true," she whispered as Kyle approached. "The genetic crisis. We didn't stop it in time." Kyle peered at the screen, his stomach churning at the grotesque scan images. Fetuses with twisted limbs and malformed skulls pulsed within their Ithorian hosts. "How many?" Kyle asked, his voice hoarse. 17 confirmed cases," Zephyr replied. "We're setting up quarantine zones now, but—" An ear-splitting shriek cut her off. They rushed to a nearby room where an Ithorian female thrashed on a medical bed, her abdomen grotesquely distended. "Hold her down," a medic shouted. Kyle and Zephyr grabbed the woman's arms as she convulsed. With a sickening tearing sound, her stomach split open. A writhing mass of tentacles and scales burst forth, screeching and snapping. "Kill it!" Zephyr screamed. Kyle snatched a nearby scalpel and plunged it into the abomination. It let out an inhuman wail before going limp. In the aftermath, Zephyr made a grim proclamation. "We must euthanize the infected. It's the only way." But not everyone agreed. Reports flooded in of pregnant Ithorians fleeing the city, led by a fierce warrior named Tari. "They're heading for the Bloodmark Ranges," an intelligence officer reported. Zephyr turned to Kyle, her eyes pleading. "You have to stop them, before it's too late." Kyle assembled a team and set out into the treacherous mountains. For days they tracked the renegades, following a trail of shed scales and strange footprints. On the 5th day, they found the camp. But something was wrong. The hybrid children weren't infants. They were adolescents with wild eyes and twisted bodies. Before Kyle could radio for backup, a psychic wave slammed into him. His squad dropped to the ground, clutching their heads and screaming. Through the haze of pain, Kyle saw them. The hybrids moved with terrifying speed, tearing into his men with razor-sharp claws. He watched in horror as his team was systematically slaughtered. A familiar voice cut through the carnage. "Stop!" Tari emerged from the shadows, her belly swollen with pregnancy. She locked eyes with Kyle, recognition flashing across her face. "You," she hissed, "the father." Kyle felt an invisible force lift him off the ground. He struggled against Tari's psychic grip as she dragged him deeper into the camp. "Watch!" she commanded, her voice filled with a mixture of pride and madness. Kyle's eyes widened in revulsion as he witnessed the hybrid adolescents begin to change, their bodies contorted and stretched, scales erupting from their skin. Bones cracked and reformed as they transformed into something monstrous, something Krull. "This is the future," Tari whispered, caressing her pregnant belly. "Our future." Kyle knew he had to act. With every ounce of willpower, he fought against Tari's mental hold. "Tari," he gasped, "think of your child. This isn't right. They're not meant to exist." For a moment, Tari's eyes cleared. She looked at the mutating hybrids, then back at Kyle. Tears streamed down her face. I can't control them," she sobbed. "Kill us, please, before it's too late." With a scream of anguish, Tari released her hold on Kyle. She charged at the nearest hybrid, tackling it to the ground. "Run!" she shouted to Kyle. He didn't hesitate. Kyle sprinted into the wilderness, the sounds of combat fading behind him. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs gave out. When he finally stumbled back into the Ithorian capital days later, Kyle knew what had to be done. He marched straight to Zephyr's chambers, his face haggard and haunted. "We need the Doom Seed," he said without preamble. Zephyr recoiled. "That's madness. We can't—" "We have no choice," Kyle cut her off. "If we don't act now, everything dies." The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. Zephyr searched Kyle's face, seeing the horrors he had witnessed reflected in his eyes. With trembling hands, she retrieved a small, pulsing orb from a hidden safe. The Doom Seed hummed with terrifying potential. "The souls of our fallen demand this sacrifice," Zephyr whispered, pressing the Doom Seed into Kyle's palm. They embraced, a final farewell tinged with sorrow and unshakable duty. Kyle boarded a small craft, the Doom Seed secured in a shielded container. As he broke Ithoria's atmosphere, he allowed himself one last look at the beautiful world below. His hand hovered over the launch controls. Kyle took a deep breath and pressed the button. The Doom Seed streaked towards Ithoria's sun, a blinding flash marking its impact. The star's core destabilized, transforming into a ravenous quasar. Beams of searing radiation lanced out, engulfing Ithoria in cosmic fire. Kyle watched through tear-filled eyes as the planet he had fought so hard to save was consumed. As Ithoria crumbled into celestial dust, Kyle wept. The burden of his choice deeply affected upon him, a cruel mercy granted in the face of extinction.
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.